Hello and welcome to the Alistair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes and sharing practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. My guest today was a head teacher in a large secondary school for 20 years, raising aspirations and achievement in areas of deprivation. He's now a professional speaker on driving transformational success through creating a culture of belonging, empowerment and accountability. Today, we're going to talk about generational differences and similarities in schools and education. So, it's a big hello to Nick Bowen. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Alistair. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining me. And again, I think you're my first Superhead that I've interviewed in my podcast series. And a Superhead basically means that you ended up in your career. You've now left that, but you were basically in charge of a load of different secondary schools.
Yeah, I took over a school in Barnsley and set up a school in Barnsley from two failing schools, which was 2,300 students. So that's a really huge school. We had 400 odd in each year group, and people called it the flagship school, the super school. And the first article that appeared in the local paper referred to me as being a superhead. And I kind of finished the career still overseeing that project, but I also took on the role of supporting other schools within the local authority. Headed up what we call the Barnsley Schools Alliance, working with all those schools, particularly the secondary schools in there, and also forming a joining and partnering with the trust, an academy trust, Highland Common Academy Trust. So yeah, from starting as a head teacher, by the time I finished 20 years later, I was working in all sorts of different schools, and yeah, the term superhead kind of sticks. And but you've got to live up to the expectations of that, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, let's go back to the beginning, because actually we've established that you and I are exactly the same age. So we are of the same generation. So we're sort of cusper boomer Gen X. Do you relate to that label? Do you consider yourself to be a stereotypical early boomer, late X?
Yeah, I think I'd certainly think so. Yeah, I very much feel a cusper as well. So from the boomer, I am competitive. I often find myself saying I'm reluctantly competitive. It's like I don't want to be. Once I start something, I can't help it. I'm also really kind of self-reliant as well. I brag about the fact that I've always done my own ironing, always do my own washing, always do my own cooking. Very, very kind of self-reliant, and that's kind of a trait of Gen X as well. I was the youngest sibling. I was the only person in our family. There was four of us, four children, who went on to university, and I became a high earner. Kind of then looked after my mum with Alzheimer's, along with my brother. So some of those traits are kind of pretty standard across that, and also that notion of being really career focused, but also that real kind of Gen X thing of work-life balance, really managing to kind of have a devoted career, but also a really good social life. I kind of play hard and work hard at the same time. Yeah. So I do identify with that.
Let's talk a little bit about your work, because, of your generation, you will have seen tremendous differences between schools when you grew up versus today. And I think for a lot of older generations who haven't been into schools, they have no idea what it's like in a school these days. Yes, you said yours were failing schools, but when you took them on, but they will have evolved and become the schools that they are today over a long period of time. So give us a bit of an idea of an overview, if you like, of how education has changed in the last, say, 30, 40 years.
I think I think the most glaring thing for me is accountability. So I'll start with that. You know, when I first started teaching, there was pretty much zero accountability from a staff point of view. So, for example, as a young teacher, when the examinations results came out, kind of nobody was kind of looking at those. There was no comparisons between schools. There was no league tables. No one was there was no real performance management. It sounds like I'm painting a really bad picture. They were really happy places, but in terms of accountability, you know, there really was very, very little accountability. And you know, stories that you have. You know, I remember, you know, PE teachers sitting on with their feet up on the desk, reading the newspaper, sending the kids to do a few laps around the field. Now, those are fairly stereotypical views, but that for me has been one of the real things. That the profession, if you like, has become much more professional. There's huge amount of accountability now. There's a huge amount at stake. You know, head teachers have to make sure that the school is meeting the needs of that community, and that results are being achieved. Teachers have to perform. There's a very robust performance management system now for teachers, and you know, students very much pushed with targets. Lots of much more use of benchmarking, and I see all those things as being a really good thing about the profession, because, you know, if you worked in sales and you kind of, you know, you sold a bit one day, you didn't one day you didn't really bother working very hard to say, you know, and at the end of the day you weren't selling very much, you know, you'd be a very poor salesman. You'd probably end up getting the sack. Whereas it was possible, you know, back 30-40 years ago, you were kind of empowered, if you like, to, you know, you get on with it, you're the professional, you know what you're doing. And actually, you know, there needs to be that level of accountability. And I think that's one of the things that's really important for me. The other thing that... And what
about the... Sorry. Oh, sorry, yeah, carry on.
I think the other thing I think that's happened is schools have become much more inclusive places and having to focus much more on the whole child in terms of their well-being. Now, you know, schools have always had a duty of care, but I think, you know, there's, you know, I think of when I retired, you know, and left a huge setup of well-being and inclusion services within the school, you know, to make sure that students were being supported, that they weren't being excluded, that their needs were being met, that their families' needs were often being met as well. That I'd say has been a really big change. And I guess the third thing for me would be a strong focus now on, you know, preparing young people for the world of work, and a real emphasis on skills and, you know, on the numerous routes that there are into, you know, gainful employment and future learning. You know, I always felt in the past people kind of fell off the end of the cliff. People left school often at the age of 15 or 16, and kind of that was it. And there's much more. There's much more focus on, you know, making sure that people are getting the right training and getting into great employment. And universities
when it comes
part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, some people, it's quite interesting you speaking quite positively about the level of accountability of schools, because you sometimes read in the press that, you know, reports that some schools and heads and teachers, you know, feel constricted by the level of accountability and the level of you know, what they have to do with reporting and so on. But I could see us going down a bit of a political route there, so I'll steer well clear of that one. But I'd be really interested to see just the way that you communicate with students today. Compare it to when you first came into education, the way that you communicate with students. How's that changed?
I think maybe it's because I was a cusper, but when I first started teaching, I was able to really relate to and form some really positive relationships with the young people, with the students. And as I progressed through my career, kind of to the further end, when you get to say Gen Z, then the issue has been much more around. It has become harder. It's become harder in terms of communicating with young people, I think, as time has gone on. So, I roughly spent the first part of my career teaching Gen X, spent the rest of the time teaching millennials, and finished my career in the big school mainly with Gen Zs. And it was.
Is it harder though because of the gap between your generation and theirs, or is it something more fundamental than that?
It's interesting because it would be easy to kind of say, as you kind of get older, you lose touch with the younger generation. But I think it's more than that, really. I think it's attitudinal, really. I think, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean in a positive way. When I first started teaching, it was very much, that kind of the Generation X was very much around, you're the teachers, yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir, do this because I tell you to, do as you're told. People towed the line, and now people are, young people are much more questioning. They're much more aware of what they think their rights are. They're more willing to challenge, and why do I have to do this, sir? Why are we doing this? And and teaching. I'm always very clear. Teaching is not about you're not there to be their friends. They've got enough friends. They don't want teachers as friends. But I found as time went on in my career, you had to. And I think it's a good thing. Teachers had to earn the respect of the students in a way that they perhaps didn't have to in the early days. Now, teachers in the early days did go out and kind of, those people who took the time, they got the respect. Those teachers who didn't, they might not have got the respect, but people would have still told the line because that's what you did. You're the teacher and I have to do as I'm told. And whereas now, teachers who struggle to communicate with young people and who struggle to develop a relationship, they're the staff, if you like, then who struggle to teach effectively, to get the best out of the students. And that's where you then get issues around kind of student behaviour, students' attitude to the subject, and students and teachers who kind of go out of their way to develop that relationship, and it's not easy. I remember, as a head teacher, standing in the middle of the main hall with hundreds of kids around, saying to this kid, "Come here," and he just looked at me and went, "No," and kind of walked off. Now obviously he was dealt with later, and me and him had developed a really good relationship because I took the time to do that, and in the end he would do anything for me. But at the time, in the old days, I don't think that would have happened, that someone would have just walked away. And again, I'm not painting a bad picture. I'm saying I think it's a positive picture in some respects.
But do you think that is also to do with parenting, that's changed a lot? We hear a lot about the young. People suggest that the young are being more entitled. And then I hear from other people who are in the teaching profession that actually it's the parenting that's become more entitled. Where do you stand on that one?
It is. And, I think, it's hard because everyone's a parent. So as soon as I open my mouth and start speaking, I'm going to insult the whole of the population. But it's kind of, what we kind of see is, what I see really is that, when people say to me or to anybody especially who works in senior leadership or even as a teacher, what's the worst part of the job or whatever, I guarantee most people will say parents. Parents, they have the best interests of they love their children, they care about their children. I get that, but the parents have become enormously more demanding. Now, in terms of holding schools to account to make sure that they're doing the best for the children, that's a good thing. But you've also then got, if I had 2,300 students, I had several thousand parents, all who may have had a different view of how things should be done. And I suppose, when I first started teaching, on the whole, parents would kind of say, well, the school knows what they're doing, we'll kind of leave them to it. Whereas now, parents, are much more want to be, holding the school to account, and in many ways, over defending their students. I could give you a simple example of, telling a kid to tuck his shirt in. Suddenly the kid's saying, well, why do I have to tuck my shirt in? And you kind of say, well, because I tuck my shirt in, it's just a rule in school. We all want to look smart. And then the child kind of, starts tutting, and so then they start swearing, and then you send them home, and then the parents come in, and instead of saying, look, I'm ever so sorry, a parent will come in, and it's like, well, I can't believe he was sent home for not tucking his shirt in, and then you're having to get into an argument with the parent to say, well, actually, no, that's not the case, it actually kind of flared up, and then there was some swearing, and then he was very rude, and it would have been better if he'd just tucked his shirt in, and then a parent will say, well, I brought my child up to question. I brought my child up, not to just accept rules. And now, obviously, I'm just painting a particular scenario, but I'm trying to say that, over time, there has been more of that than, than there was in the past. However,
we hear that a lot, don't we, about the questioning of younger people.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, they're questioning at school, and then of course they get to university and they get into the workplace, and they're questioning the workplace. And as I always say in my research that I did for my book, is that what happens in a young person's early years, and that carries on throughout their life. And when bosses are saying, well, why are they questioning? It's a very clear reason for it, because they've been doing it all their lives up to that point.
Yeah.
So how do you steer those children in a way where they're going to have a better understanding of the expectations of them? Because it's tough, isn't it? You want to let them express themselves on one hand, but also we're in a conformative society. So where's that balance, and how do you communicate that?
It is, and it is a balance, because on the one hand, I just painted a particular picture there where it's quite frustrating, but do we want generations of young people coming through where they're just saying yes sir, no sir, three bagfuls sir, I'll just do as I'm told? It's a good thing, but I think it's the sorts of conversations we'll be having will be around, it's all well and good, to question, but there comes a time when you have to understand that, you are one person with a particular view, but for the good of the whole community, it's important that we do this. Now, I think it's important that, that schools in doing this don't just, kind of want to go back to the good old days or whatever, the bad old days or whatever you want to call it. I think it's, making sure that, in the classrooms, around the school, in the relationships that you have, that, those conversations are important. The person who's always late, you're talking to say, you do realise that if this happens, in the world of work, you'll lose your job. And, well, I don't care. Well, then you won't have any money. Do you like going out? Do you like partying? Do you like... Well, you wouldn't be able to do that, And having those kind of conversations, I think, is a good way of kind of getting to know the young people and kind of, I suppose, harnessing that wonderful ability to want to question. And turning it into something that's not destructive, that's something that's productive, that you don't kind of allow it to just keep going down, down cul-de-sacs, and it's not going anywhere, and it's just unhelpful.
It's a huge responsibility being a teacher, isn't it? Because you're responsible for the next generation who are coming into our communities, into our workplaces, and the way that you shape them is going to be massively instrumental in their futures. And for you as a superhead, turning around a school that was failing to one that is now serving the community in a far better way, how do you deal with that level of responsibility and not drive yourself mad? Because it's such a big job.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, I often used to hear myself saying, if I'd have thought about it too much, I really would have just frightened myself to death. I think it is a huge responsibility, and I think in a way that's then what drives you. I mean, one of the things that I often hear teachers say is, I want to, I want to have the same expectations for all the students I teach that I do for my own children. I want to have the best for these children who I'm responsible for, as I am for my own children at home. I think teachers themselves, but also and leaders like myself, head teachers, it's constantly remembering and focusing on the fact that this is somebody's son, this is somebody's daughter, this life matters, their future matters, and we can't give up, we can't exclude, we can't go for an easy life. It really is important, and I've seen the profession become much more professional as people, as I've said earlier on, as schools have become much more accountable for what they're achieving and what they're doing and how they're kind of meeting the well-being needs of the students and being inclusive. Schools are much better places. I remember, again, going back to the old days, where there would be things. Well, there was often an attitude of, listen, if you don't want to learn, then don't. Go and stand outside. Go and sit over there if you don't want to learn. And we're kind of that is never allowed to happen now in school. It's very much now. We will force you to learn, but we will find ways in which you will learn. We'll find ways in which you can engage with the school, and we're not going to give up on you because you matter. I've seen much more.
And now you work with businesses, and you lead transformation and culture change. What kind of things directly relate to your time working in schools that you can now apply to business? What are the sort of things that you're dealing with in the workplace culture that you've learned from your experience as a superhead?
I think for me, in setting up that school, and taking two communities and bringing them together into a new building, a totally new setup, I learned very quickly the importance of community and the importance of people belonging. Because I'd taken people from schools where they felt they really belonged, where they were really happy and fulfilled, if you like, and put them somewhere where they didn't really want to be. So I had to really work at building a community and developing this notion of belonging. And I think when people feel that they belong to something and that they buy in, then they're going to be their best. They're going to feel their best, and they're going to deliver their best. Now, that was one of the things that whether you're a school, whether you're a business, you need to build community, build connection, and make sure that people feel that they belong. I believe that gives them dignity, and I think it makes them feel fulfilled, and we get the best out of them. However, for me as well, that's one element of it, but it's not enough. And this is where I talk. For me, the next phase really is about getting the balance right between empowerment and accountability, because I think if we empower people, but in a kind of a way, a kind of a fake empowerment, where you're kind of saying, well, you guys are the professionals, you know what you're doing, you get on with it, then, human nature will mean that, well, some will, some won't, some will do really well, some won't, some will be lazy, some will, and accountability, in a way, allows, once people know that they're being held account, I think that people want to be held account. I often found two things that I'll say about this. One is any surveys we did in school around what it was that made staff unhappy or not happy with their job. Right up there was always seeing other people not doing their job properly and not being held to account for it. That's one thing I'll say. And the other thing, when we first opened the school, there was at the end of the first year, we got the first set of exam results. We put a big list of all the subjects on what their achievement was for the students that they taught, and we ranked them in order. People were kind of like, you can't do that, but we did it. The department that was at the bottom in terms of what they'd achieved, the following year, because they said, well, I'm not going to sit there and have that again, the following year they were at the top. Now, once you get that kind of level of accountability, as I say, whether that's in a school or a business, that then makes people think, well, actually, once you trust people that they can deliver, then for me that's earned autonomy, and that's where you give people autonomy. You say, yeah, you're not saying you're the professional, get on with it, and just kind of blindly abdication of responsibility, of leadership responsibility. What you're doing then is saying, actually, I know you can perform. I've seen you perform. I've seen the results. I'm happy with what you've done. Now I'm going to empower you to go and get on with that, do that. I can trust you. I know you're going to deliver. And I think that is where you get, for me, that's where I saw transformational success. I saw...
And looking... Sorry to interrupt. I was just thinking that, I'm looking at you now in the workplace, and you've got a very different perspective, having worked in schools. What advice do you give to older people in the workplace? People like us, who are late Gen X, early boomer, and therefore at a period of time when people are thinking maybe I'll be moving away from the workplace, but you can give them that extra lease of life because they get it. What kind of things have you taken from schools that have enabled those kind of conversations to take place?
I just think it's around the wealth of experience that people have, that people kind of gather over their time, and being able to use that. I think I found that training head teachers of the future, training senior teachers of the future, was a great way in as I kind of came towards the end of my career, where I felt I've got so much that I want to offer, but you've got to offer, but you've done a job for 30 years, 35 years, you've still got a huge amount to offer, but you also you feel like you've done it. You don't want to kind of go off into the sunset. And I found the last 5 years of my career, I did a huge amount of training, a huge amount of coaching, a huge amount of speaking, and I think people need to realise that at that kind of twilight of the career, that the knowledge and the understanding and the lessons that they've learned over the time in their role, then that's their legacy. That's what they can pass on to the generation coming up, and not see themselves as people who, I'm a has-been, and I see that, and I've seen that in schools and the places that I've worked. And I've seen it in business. I was talking to a CEO the other day, 70 odd years old, still firing on all cylinders, still got great experience to offer, and kind of bringing people through in that business and bringing that people through in an organisation, I think is something that's incredibly fulfilling at that age.
And how does a person of that age then communicate that? Because it's one thing having that level of experience, but it's then also relating to those younger generations in the way that they communicate that is really crucial, because you can have all that experience, you can have all of that value, but if that message doesn't get received, it's really hard.
Yeah, it is. And I think one of the things that I think I would advise people to do, and to do more of, is actually because I don't think people do it, is have a look at the various characteristics of younger generations. Have a look at if I was speaking, if I was wanting to give advice to teachers now, I'd be saying, well, most of the students that will be coming through now will be Generation Alpha. They're not Gen Gen Zs. They're not millennials. Have you thought about how different they are? Have you thought about the fact that, before you start talking to them, that, they had 2 years of their lives totally disrupted and weren't in school? How that affected us as adults, but imagine how it affected them as young people. Think of kind of where they are. Think of, or another example might be social media. We talk a lot about the, Gen Zs being very much, a lot of anxiety, issues with mental health. And it's very easy to kind of go, oh God, they need to just pull their socks up and get on with it. Back in the old days, we didn't have this. But back in the old days, we didn't have the spotlight, the huge spotlight of social media. You did think of some things you did stupid in school one day and everyone would laugh at you and then it'd be forgotten the next day. It's never forgotten now. It's filmed there and then and put out there for everyone to see. That's a huge pressure. Now, if people don't understand that, then it's difficult to communicate because you're not understanding where they're coming from. And I think actively doing that research, I'd be really interested in the sort of work that you're doing, being part of a teacher training course. That, the sorts of, as you go through your career, you will see different generations coming through. It's important that you actually understand that and research that and see how it impacts. Because otherwise, if you try and teach to Generation Alphas, as I taught to, Gen X's, it's going to clash.
And you're absolutely right. And I would be delighted if you did recommend me to schools and to to teacher training places, because you're absolutely right. It starts from understanding the new generations, the emerging generations. And likewise, there's an element where the younger generations need to understand the older generations, and if everyone works together to get that understanding, then we're going to be in a much better place. Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you. There's some real nuggets in there that we can really use to help us bridge that generation gap. So thank you so much indeed for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Alistair.
Thank you very much, Nick. And thank you for joining us as well. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time with another podcast. In the meantime, thanks very much. Bye-bye. The Alistair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alistair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.